Hello, everybody, and welcome to Disassembly Required. As always, I'm your host, Jolene, and it's January. So, you know what that means. It's time for Hollywood to take out their trash. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, today we're going to be talking about dump months. Now, any moviegoer knows that even subconsciously they might acknowledge it, but they might not have physically acknowledged it. But generally, in months like January and February, movies that seem to be released are generally pretty awful. You don't need to look any further than this month, where we have such glorious films as the Bad Boys sequel, the remake of The Grudge, let's see what other glorious movies were released this month, because there's just so many that are just absolute. They're so bad. So, well, even now looking towards for January, there was also Cats, which was released at the end of 2019. I believe it was on Christmas, and boy, oh boy, was that. God, that was a nightmare. I wish I could forget the Cats movie. For those who don't, I'm sorry, I originally started talking about dumb months, but we're just going to be talking about generally when bad movies are released and how that affects everything. But the holiday season generally is considered to be unprofitable for a lot of companies, and this, of course, includes the industry that is movie making in Hollywood. But another example of this is in anybody who does YouTube, obviously, like as a job, knows that during January, ad revenue goes down a lot because people spend a lot of money on, Christmas stuff, and companies spend a lot of money on Christmas advertising, so not as many ads often get released, and there's not really a lot going on money-wise in January compared to the other months. But just this month, we have such films as Like a Boss, which stars Tiffany Haddish and Rose Byrne and Salma Hayek. And I saw that the other day because I have poor judgment. That's not good either. I only saw it because I also watched it with a friend, which is the only way to watch a bad movie, is you have to experience it with somebody else. There was The Grudge, which released this month, which was just absolutely atrocious. One of the strangest parts about that movie is the fact that of course, since it's a modern horror movie, there's jump scares. And during the jump scares, the sound just cuts off. It's the weirdest thing. Like, normally in a jump scare, like, that's where they peak the audio levels. That's where the sound is, like, supposed to come out of nowhere and scare the hell out of you. But for some reason, the audio just completely cuts out for the jump scares in The Grudge. There's also the new horror movie Underwater with Kristen Stewart, and I believe TJ Miller is in it as well. Yeah, TJ Miller's in it, and I haven't seen that one. I kind of want to, just because it looks interesting. I always enjoy things that can be done with water in horror movies, because a lot of the ocean is very unexplored, so it's a good region for horror movies. Oh God, I forgot this movie was being released this month. Doolittle. Now, everybody knows that Robert Downey Jr. and Tom Holland are wonderful actors. And this is not, of course, an attempt to shit on them by any means. But they both star in The Voyage of Dr. Dolittle, which comes out this week on the 17th. So that should be an experience, I guess. It doesn't look very good. It looks like they use a lot of very like cheesy CGI. There's another terrible horror movie. Well, I say terrible, but it has that look of like that. It looks like somebody saw The Witch and is trying to copy it and not doing very well. But I can't entirely judge because it releases at the end of the month, so I haven't seen it yet, obviously. Let's see, what other movies? Nothing really of note, actually. Yeah, it was a bit surprising, but it's bound to happen. But so dump months generally are January, February, March, April, August, and September. April, August, and September are kind of in a bit of the gray area. They're more towards the profitable region. But generally, like, movies released around that time can also be a bit more on the... They're expected to do worse. Dump months are a bit less of a common thing, or were a bit less of a common thing for a certain period of time when Netflix first started to go up a lot. Excuse me. Because when Netflix started offering to buy movies, that's what studios would start to do if they thought a movie was bad or wouldn't do well. They just sell it to Netflix. They would dump it on Netflix. And Netflix, of course, is, doing great. And they have no shortage of content. And it's very interesting to see just how interesting a lot of this movie stuff is, because, for instance, like, Netflix was known for a while as like a dumping ground, basically. But even they wouldn't take the Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly Sherlock Holmes movie because they thought it was so awful that it couldn't possibly do well on their platform. And anyone has seen that. I'm very sorry for anybody who has seen that. I feel your pain, for I have seen it too. You're not the only one cursed with knowledge. It's an absolute travesty. It's insane to look at a movie like that be made in, I believe it was 2018. It was made and it was released at the end of 2018, like just on the edge of January. And boy, oh boy, was it terribly received. It did worse than they thought it would, which was interesting. But yeah, like the part of summer, of course, being known as, summer blockbusters, go a lot of movies. A lot of people generally want to go out more. They might have more free time. Kids want to go to the movies. That's why a lot of bigger movies generally tend to be released in, May, June, and July. But April, August, and September kind of can go in there a little bit because they might be a bit better, but they might not be as good as projected because they do a lot of tests for a lot of these movies. But the dump months, known as the like winter and beginning of spring, could be a host of some of the most absolutely atrocious movies. And it's one of those things where, if you really think about it, a lot of times if you go and see a movie around that time, it's going to be awful. The only exception to that is if it's going to be like a Marvel movie, or, well, actually, no, just if it's going to be a Marvel movie, because they released, if I remember correctly, they released, I think Captain Marvel was released in March last year. And Black Panther was released in February in 2018. So there was that. And yeah, it's really just odd to see, like, to finally notice after all these years that it's actually like a thing. Because sometimes, movies, of course, are subjective. You might think a movie is terrible, but 100 people might think it's good. Take, for instance, Suicide Squad. Now, Suicide Squad is a abhorrent piece of trash, and it's awful from every perspective. The acting is terrible, but that's the fault of the script, because, of course, Will Smith and Margot Robbie are great actors. I can't necessarily speak for anybody else in the movie because I can't recall anything I've seen them in. Actually, I think Viola Davis, if I remember correctly, that's who played Amanda Waller in that movie. She's also very good. I've seen her in other things. But there are some people who generally need to see good movies and then rewatch Suicide Squad. But there are some people who generally, my brain keeps trying to autocorrect generally and genuinely, just like use them interchangeably. Brain's still a bit, I'm still a bit tired. But some people actually genuinely believe that Suicide Squad is a great movie, despite the fact that most people who have seen the film agree it's terrible. Now, of course, that's to be expected with like any movie. Any movie you see it, someone is going to think that it's good, someone is going to think that it's terrible, and the amount of which is going to, vary on the movie. For instance, there are some people who enjoy the Cats movie, mostly because it's absolutely horrifying. And you watch the movie and you're like, how did something like this get made? And you just enjoy the thought process of what these people must have been going through making this nightmare of a film. But finally looking at all the trends of movies that have developed over the 20th century, it's actually interesting because it was a very sort of slow progression, like people realizing with like the increasing commercialism with the holiday season and just how much the work schedule around December and January started to get, more structured around, all the different holidays, mostly Christmas, because, people want to believe it's a Christian nation despite the fact that we have no official religion, but, semantics. And it just from a filmmaking perspective, seeing a movie like, for instance, The Grudge be released in 2020 after like the awful flop that was, I believe it was Rings. It was the sequel to The Ring, but it was like an American version. So obviously it wasn't as good as the original version, which was Japanese, because it didn't have the same vision. We don't have the same sort of like aspects of horror as they do, so it's gonna hit differently with the audience, which I always think is interesting when people are like, let's just bring it over. It doesn't always work that way, but people want to try what they want to try. So we end up here with a movie like The Grudge, where we have a stale script. Just the acting isn't entirely terrible, but it's also nonsensical in a sort of way. Like, have you ever seen a movie and you watch it and you're just thinking to yourself, like, were these people okay making this film? Like, for instance, if anyone has watched The Shining, they'll know that Stanley Kubrick, like, really messed with Shelley Duvall in that film, like, behind the scenes, so that she would constantly be, like, on edge and, like, ready to freak out at any moment and just completely emotionally distraught because he wanted her to give a better performance. Now, obviously, that's terrible, but sometimes it can be, like, having that sort of emotion is, of course, good for a sort of film like that, for a horror film. But it seems like any acting thought process that could have gone into this movie was taken just in the palm of each of these actors' hands and just thrown right into a wood chipper. And it's baffling, really, what it is, because the modern horror market has a lot of really good films in it. Of course, it has a lot more stinkers than it does good films, but there are, like, some really solid films. Like, you had Hereditary. Midsommar wasn't as good, but it was still, like, really, like, stunning. There was also The Witch. But then you also have, like, the more commercial horror films, like Insidious, which apparently is getting a sequel. It's getting a 5th movie. Put that into perspective for a moment. That there have been 4 Insidious movies, and it's interesting because a lot of those movies always do bad. A lot of, like, the more commercial horror movies don't do well. And it's interesting to see that, like, because I used to not think a lot about it when a horror movie was released in, like, January or March or February, and I would just be like, oh, they're just, trying to spread it out so that they don't, like, take all of the horror movies and put them in, like, the fall season, because that would kind of make sense, because a lot of people associate horror movies with the fall season because October and Halloween, of course. But it's, oh, excuse me, I think the burger I had's trying to come back up to fight me. But a lot of the horror movies, for instance, because I'm a big fan of horror movies, so they usually stick out a lot more to me than action movies or dramas or whatever. But a lot of the horror movies that are released in January, I started to notice when I was younger that they're not good. They're usually, like, mediocre at best. They're just like, that was a movie, I think. But it's interesting because of all of the different ways that movies are marketed as well. A lot of different movies will market, like, different ways, of course. You want to bring, like, for instance, horror movies are often marketed as, like, you are, like, going to, like, get the pants scared off you, or, whatever. I don't know, I was trying to think of a funny euphemism or pun, but again, brain's still not working today. But family movies, of course, or movies that might genuinely be considered to have a younger audience, will, of course, be marketed to the kids as well as the parents, in a sense, because you want to have, if you're going to release a family movie, you want the parents to look at it and be like, all right, I can go take my kid to see that movie. But it's funny because sometimes a movie, like a bad movie, will be released in January or February or March, and it will be a kid's movie. And those are an experience sometimes. Because those are the movies you watch it and you're like, oh, this isn't really for kids, is it? Like, sometimes they'll put in too many adult jokes, or sometimes they just won't understand what kids think are funny or is funny, like it's interesting because they also have the awareness to put it in one of these dump months, but they don't have enough awareness to make the movie better. So bad movies also often generally there is a bit of a theme, you could say, to February bad movies, because a lot of them, a lot of people associate February with like Valentine's Day. So sometimes there tend to be a bit more of like romance movies, like romantic comedies or romantic dramas, whatever, released in February, and they're often not great. But it's also one of those things where, around that time, around January and February, a lot of people are still trying to pick back up with work or school or whatever. So if they do see a movie, a lot of times, unless it's really awful, it's just going to go right out of people's heads, which is somewhat important considering how awful these movies are. Because, I don't think anybody really would want to remember Like a Boss with Tiffany Haddish and Rose Byrne. It's so bad, and I really hope nobody wants to remember The Grudge. I'm pretty sure that by the time actual good horror movies start rolling out, we're gonna completely forget that Hansel and Gretel, or Gretel and Hansel, or whatever it's called, because I think it actually was Gretel and Hansel. Hold on, let me double check just because I don't want to be wrong. Yes, Gretel and Hansel. Oh God, there's another one. There's also a sequel to The Boy coming out. The Boy was the movie about the doll, and that's being released in February 21st. And that's going to be special. That's all I can say about that. Is it's going to be a special experience. However, apparently they're releasing another Halloween movie this October. That's going to be released on October 16th. So hopefully, we can all hope, it will be decent. Apparently this one's called Halloween Kills, which is a terrible name for a film. Also, the sequel to The Boy is called Brahms: The Boy 2, as if The Boy 2 is the subheader, or I can't remember the exact term, but you know what I mean, which is just very peculiar and odd. Just the fact that they even made a sequel to that movie. So, bit of a history on dump months. It's a bit of a history on dump months. So back during, there was a bit of a monopoly actually in the film industry. Obviously, originally there was Thomas Edison attempted to have a monopoly on the industry, but he would actually send thugs to go interrupt movies and stuff like that weren't his movies or whatever, which I always find the history of the crazy stuff Thomas Edison did to be fascinating, just because people consider him to be a brilliant inventor, but he was also a dick. It wasn't a great guy. However, there was during a time that Paramount Pictures, most people know Paramount, a lot of films, of course, Paramount logo. Paramount Pictures had a sort of monopoly, and they got broken up a bit. So, because they didn't have as much control over the market, the movies were seen as, especially during, January, February, the winter months, were seen as not being as openly profitable. For instance, it was a lot easier to lose money when you don't own the industry, essentially. Uh, in, I believe it was, yes, in the 40s, there was it was considered to be the best decade for dump months. That decade had The Grapes of Wrath, His Girl Friday, and Shop Around the Corner, which were often considered to be like classic movies. Grapes of Wrath, I mean, anybody who's read the book has probably seen the movie, probably had to watch it in high school or something. I know I had to watch, what was the other John Steinbeck novel? Of Mice and Men. I had to watch a movie about, or based on Of Mice and Men, and I also had to read that in high school. And then in the 70s, that's when they started to get more into the summer blockbuster sort of thing. Because in the 70s, of course, you had a lot of really big famous movies. You had Jaws, Star Wars. I believe the 70s when the first Alien movie came out, which was a fantastic film. If you haven't seen the original Alien, I highly, highly recommend you watch it. It's just a fantastic horror movie. And Sigourney Weaver is an amazing actress, obviously. She's great in the film. The effects are done really well. And just the cinematography, the way that they shoot around the fact that the alien is just a guy in a suit to make it look scary. It's just incredible what they do in that film. Anyway, so after, that started up, they started to generally go more towards some blockbusters. And of course, critics started to notice as well, and that's where a lot of the movie culture sort of comes from when it comes to like how movies are made, movies are released, is critical reception, of course. So when critics started to realize that there were some real stinkers being released in January and February, they started to, of course, be writing about it. One movie critic wrote that it was essentially a movie hell, which I think is interesting. Same critic, Janet Maslin, is her name. In addition to calling it movie hell, she also said that it's well known that January films have a character that is, let us say, distinctive. What is it that leads film distributors to regard January as just the right resting place for so many flukes, black sheep, wild cards, and also rans? I don't know what that last one means, but yeah, it started to get really noticed around the 80s. And now it's just a general given thing. It's interesting also just because of when movies are made too can also have an effect on it. Movies that often can get delayed a lot can be released during these months, because if it's released during that month, then it's projected that they're going to be losing money anyway. So, they've had the time to set up the industry around, if we're going to lose money around this time, we have a movie we don't think is going to do that well, or it's been delayed a lot, and so there's not as much interest in it. We're going to put it in January, February, March. For instance, I know the New Mutants movie is coming out this year, or I say is coming out this year, but it keeps getting delayed, or kept getting delayed for the past 3 or 4 years. When I watched the trailer that they had put out a couple weeks ago, it said that there was no official release date, but I just checked. The official release date is April, which still fits in a bit to the dump month category. That's more in the sort of beginning of the summer blockbuster season. end of the whole dump month season, but that's still the area where, people might want to go outside, might want to watch a movie, go with some friends, whatever. But they don't have the highest expectations of what they're going to watch. That was used to be a bigger concern as to part of the dump month culture that had been created, was because, weather was a lot more harsh. We used to get a lot more snow. Then global warming happened. Now we're here. It's it's crazy, just that as a concept, that probably 10 years ago, where I currently live would be completely covered in snow. Maybe not a lot, but just enough to be oh yeah, it's winter. Now it's just sad. Now it's just dead trees. But nonetheless, because of course the weather was a lot harsher, people obviously, their first thought wasn't, oh, I'm going to go see a movie today because it's snowing. People are like, no, I'm going to stay inside and not have the possibility of dying in the snow, which of course is a sensible, consideration for most people. Some people might, be absolutely crazy and just be like, yeah, let's do it. It's goddamn blizzard outside. Let's go see a movie. I did that once. I went to go see a movie in, I went to go see the first Deadpool when it released. I believe it was in February. And there was a good foot of snow outside. It had actually started snowing when we left the house. And then when we came back, or when we had left the movie, there was a foot of snow outside. And we had to dig our car out, which was just wonderful. But that used to be not as much, but still a concern in more of the northern states. But that's just a bit of brief history, brief introduction to just, dump months. So sort of a buyer beware in a sense of, if you're going to go see a movie on, in February, if you're planning on, or January or March or April or August or September, really just going to see a movie at a time where you're just I don't really know if there's any good movies out. If you have to say that in your head, there's probably not any good movies out. So those are just my thoughts. Leave yours, I guess, wherever. Comments. Also follow me on Twitter. You can find my Twitter in the About section on my channel. And I will catch you all next time. Sorry about the shorter episode, but I wanted to try something that was a bit more easily digestible. I'll see y'all next time, and I hope that you have a lovely day. Goodbye.